Welcome to The Forgotten Soldier by Guy Sajer, a gripping and deeply personal story of a young soldier caught up in the chaos of World War II. It's raw, emotional, and pulls you right into the life of someone who lived through one of the most brutal fronts of the war, the Eastern Front. These are his words, and let's begin. We started off again. One of the wounded had come to the front and taken Ernst's place, a stupid-looking man who fell asleep almost at once. 10 minutes later, the motor coughed and then died. The jolt woke my sleeping companion. Something wrong with the engine? No, I said in an offhand voice. We're out of gasoline. Shit. So what'll we do? We'll walk. On this nice sunny day it should be grand. The strongest will have to help the others. My friend's death had abruptly turned me into a cynic, and I felt almost glad that the others would have to suffer with me. My companion looked me up and down. You don't mean that. We can't walk. We're all burning up with fever. His stupid assurance made me furious. He was clearly a half-wit who never questioned anything and had gone to war because he'd been sent. Then a Russian shell had gone off too close and he'd been pierced, and that is all he felt or knew. Since then, he'd been dozing and stuffing himself with sulfanilamide. Well, you can stay here and wait for help, or for Ivan. I'm clearing out. I ran to the back door, kicked it open, and explained the situation. Inside, it stank. The men were lying in a revolting mess. Some of them didn't even hear me, and I felt ashamed and brutal. But what else was there to do? 7 or 8 haggard men pulled themselves up. Their faces were amazingly drawn. Shaggy beards sprouted from their lined cheeks, and their eyes burned with fever. I felt sickened and unwilling to insist that they walk. When they had climbed down, they discussed the fate of the others. It's impossible to get them up. Let's just leave without telling them. Maybe someone will be along to help them. They're still coming behind us. Our wretched group set off, haunted by the dying men we had abandoned in the Tatra. But what else could we have done? I was the only man without an injury and the only man with a gun. I had offered Nubak's gun, but no one wanted to carry it. A short time later, a muddy sidecar caught up with us and stopped, although we hadn't flagged them. It carried 2 soldiers who belonged to an armored unit, 2 generous men. One of them decided to give his place to a wounded man, and collecting his belongings, got out and walked with us. Somehow the sidecar managed to take on 3 wounded, and so once more I had a strong young man to keep me company, whose humane gesture, if nothing else, made him a sympathetic human being. I no longer remember his name, but I do remember that we talked long and deeply about many things. He told me that the Russian offensive had been mounted very suddenly, and that throughout this vast region we might be stopped at any moment by a Russian motorized unit. My throat went dry, but my companion seemed sure of himself and of our army. We'll resume the offensive now that it's spring. We'll throw the Popovs back across the Don, and then the Volga. It's astonishing how agreeable it is to meet confidence and enthusiasm when one is feeling lost. It was as if heaven had sent me this healthy animal to revive my morale. I would have liked things more if Nubak had still been alive, but one must remain humble and resigned in the face of Providence. After all, it was I who should have been driving instead of Nubak. Toward evening, we came to an isolated country farmhouse. We approached cautiously. The partisans often used places like this. They had the same choices we did, and for anyone, a roof is a roof. The tall young man who had joined us walked out ahead, slowly and deliberately, with his hand on his gun. For a moment, he disappeared behind the farmyard buildings, and we felt a twinge of anxiety. But he reappeared and waved us on. The farm was inhabited by a group of Russians who did everything they could to make the wounded men comfortable. The women cooked us a hot meal. They told us that they hated communism. They had been deported from a small farm they had owned in the neighborhood of Vitebsk to work on the big kolkhoz we were now walking through. They said they had often given shelter to German soldiers. They had an amphibious Volkswagen in one of their sheds, which had broken down and been abandoned by one of our sections. They said that the partisans never bothered them because they knew that the Wehrmacht often used their buildings. Our tall newcomer felt somewhat uneasy about the Volkswagen. The Russians might be lying. They could have stolen it. We tried to start it, but although the engine turned over, the vehicle wouldn't move. "We'll fix it tomorrow," the big man said. "We ought to rest now. I'll take the first watch, and you can relieve me at midnight." "We're going to stand watch?" I asked in surprise. "We have to. You can't trust these people. All Russians are liars." This meant another night of anxiety. I walked to the back of the shed, which was dark. There was a jumble of sacks, sheaves of dried sunflower stalks, ropes, and boards, which I arranged as a rough bed. I was about to take off my boots when my companion stopped me. "Don't do that. You'll never be able to stand them tomorrow. You have to let them dry on your feet." I was on the point of replying that the sodden leather would prevent my feet from drying, but I didn't. What difference did it make if my feet were wet or my boots were wet? I myself was soaked through and filthy and so tired. "You should wash your feet, though. That will make you feel fresher and better tomorrow, too." What sort of a fellow was this? He was as dirty as I, but he seemed to be full of will and ardor and spirit, as if nothing fundamental to his being had been damaged. "I'm too tired," I said. He laughed. I threw myself down on my back, overcome by the exhaustion which ached in the muscles of my shoulders and neck. I stared into the shadows, caught by an indefinable fear. Above me the dusty beams were lost in the darkness. My sleep was leaden and dreamless. Only happy people have nightmares from overeating. For those who live a nightmare reality, sleep is a black hole, lost in time, like death. A movement of air shook my heavy head. I sat up slowly. It was already broad daylight, and the sky was shining through the wide door of the shed. Beside the door, next to a large chest, my companion of yesterday sat slumped in sleep. I jumped up like a shot. The idea crossed my mind that he might already be dead. I had learned that life and death can be so close that one can pass from one to the other without attracting any attention. The fresh morning air was shaken by the sound of explosions. I went over to the other soldier and shook him vigorously. He groaned like a drunk who is being questioned. "Wake up!" This time he stood up in a single movement. His sleep had exploded like a bomb. Instinctively he reached for his gun. I felt almost afraid. "Yes, what is it?" he asked. "Teufel, it's daylight. I fell asleep on guard, goddammit." He looked so furious that I kept myself from laughing. His inadequate vigilance had given us both a good night's sleep. Suddenly, he pointed his gun at the open door. Before I could turn around, I heard a foreign voice, and one of the Russians who had received us the day before came and stood in the doorway. "Kamerad," he repeated in German. "This morning no good. Boom, boom, pretty close." We went out of the shed. On the roof of the little building in front of us, some Russians from the kolkhoz were inspecting the horizon. We heard some more long-drawn-out explosions. "Bolsheviks very close," said one of the Ukrainians, turning to us. "We'll leave with Kamerad Soldat German." "Where are the wounded?" my companion asked, irritated at having been caught off balance. "Where you put yesterday," answered the Popov. "2 Kamerad German dead." We looked at him in confusion. "Come and help us," my companion said. 2 of the more seriously wounded men had died. There were now 4, all in poor condition. One of them was groaning and holding his right arm, whose hand was missing. His purulent dressing glistened with the gangrene which was already devouring him. "Dig 2 graves over there," ordered the tall soldier. "We must bury these men." "We not soldiers," answered the Popov, still smiling. "You dig 2 graves, insisted the German, aiming his gun at the Russians. 2 graves and quick. The Russian's eye gleamed wildly as he stared at the black hollow of the gun barrel. He said a few words in Russian, and the others busied themselves with the job. We had begun to change the dressings of the wounded when we heard the sound of a motor in the courtyard. Without thinking, we ran out. Several armored vehicles had just driven in, and a gang of German soldiers were running toward the big drinking trough. They were followed by 4 or 5 Mark-IVs. An officer climbed from a steyr, and we ran to meet him, telling him who we were. "Alles gut," said the officer. "Help us load up and leave with us." We tried to get the amphibious Volkswagen to start, but that proved impossible. We dragged it from the hut, and one of the Lanzer threw a grenade into the engine. A moment later, it blew to pieces. More vehicles arrived, others left in the direction from which we'd come. We couldn't understand what was happening. The sound of explosions from the southeast was continuous. The road that ran through the kolkhoz was a stream of traffic of every description. Whenever anyone stopped, I asked for news of my unit, but no one knew anything. It seemed likely that my companions of the 19th Rollbahn were far to the west by now, far from the front, to which it seemed I was being sent. A little while later I turned west again, in a company of soldiers drawn from many infantry units. The fact that I was involved with this group caused me considerable difficulty a few days later. We appeared to be taking a line parallel to the front, at right angles to the Russian thrust. Far to the north, the Russians were pushing toward the south, hoping to surround the German forces still in the Voronezh-Kursk-Kharkov triangle. For a day and a half, we followed a muddy rut, on which our only troubles were mechanical. The machines we were using had been in Russia since the German advance of 1941 and had been pushed hard. Our forces were obliged to abandon large numbers of trucks and tractors and tanks. The tanks in particular had taken a beating, often having been used for work their designers had never imagined. They were almost the only vehicles able to move normally during the winter months, and a tank pulling 5 trucks along a snowy mule track was not an unusual sight. When they had to face the Russian counter-offensive, this rough usage, coupled with their lightness, which had served us so well until then, made them no match for the famous T-34s, incontestably superior to the Mark IIs and IIIs. Later, our Tigers and Panthers stood up to Soviet armor and played with their T-34s and KV-85s. Unfortunately, as in the air, our inadequate numbers had to yield to an enemy multitude fighting on 2 fronts. We were obliged, in effect, to defend a fortress with a circumference of 2,000 miles. To cite a single example, the fighting on the Vistula, north of Kharkov, pitted 28,000 Germans supported by 36 Tiger tanks and 20 Panthers against 2 strong Soviet armies of 600,000 men and 7 armored regiments disposing of 1,100 tanks of various kinds. Toward noon the next day, we arrived at a small village about 15 miles northeast of Kharkov, with a name like Aucheni. I can no longer remember precisely. The place was filled with smoke, and to judge by the noise, fighting was still going on quite nearby. The steyr of the officer who had picked us up at the kolkhoz drew ahead, while the rest of us jumped down from our machines. Flickering light a mile or so to the south marked the line of fire. The soldiers who had come with me peed into a hedge or chewed some food with blank faces. I myself have never been able to achieve a resigned, indifferent attitude in the face of pressing danger. Nevertheless, I tried to hide my desperate anxiety. Perhaps the others were doing the same thing. The steyr came back, and 2 non-coms wrote down our names. Then we were organized into groups of 15, led either by a sergeant or an Obergefreiter. The officer climbed onto the seat of the steyr and spoke to us briefly, mincing no words. The enemy has cut us off from our line of retreat. To get around them, we would have to turn north onto the plain, where there are no roads. This could be fatal. Therefore, we will have to break through their barrage to reach our new positions, which are quite close. As further elements of the Don Army arrive, they will be used to maintain the passage already opened, which will allow all our soldiers to escape the Bolshevik noose. Thereafter, you will proceed to positions which will be announced and which you will maintain until further orders. Good luck. Heil Hitler. I was about to say that I belonged to the transport service when I suddenly felt ashamed. Munitions boxes were opened and their contents distributed. My pockets and cartridge pouches were full, and I was given 2 defensive grenades, which I didn't know how to operate. We moved single file to the edge of the village past houses burning from enemy incendiaries. Groups of men were walking about in the debris. Others were tending to the wounded. Some burnt-out German vehicles were still smoking. We were taken over by a lieutenant who asked 5 or 6 of us to follow him down a long street, which was still more or less intact. A salvo whistled past us, and we threw ourselves to the ground. It fell somewhere in the center of the village, about 700 or 800 yards behind us. Enemy shells had dug several holes in the packed earth which lay between 2 rows of buildings, and occasional mutilated bodies lay sprawled on the street. We walked for about 15 minutes, sticking close to the buildings, until we heard the sound of automatic weapons. About 100 yards ahead of us, the street was swept by mortar fire. We hesitated for a moment. Then we saw some running figures emerging from the wall of dust stirred up by the enemy salvo. "Achtung!" shouted the lieutenant. Instantly we dropped to our knees or even onto our stomachs, ready to open fire, but stood up again when we saw German uniforms. The other soldiers ran over to us and threw themselves down by our sides. We could see that still more were coming through the flying dust. Several of them were howling at the tops of their lungs, a sound which combined fear, anger, and pain. I watched a soldier without a gun who was trying to run, holding his right thigh with both hands. He fell, stood up, and fell again. 2 others were staggering slowly after him. I heard someone shout, "À moi!" and was trying to see which of them had used my language when a fresh salvo struck the group, scattering about 10 of them in search of shelter. 2 of the men continued toward us despite the danger. They ran to a door, which they were able to kick in without much trouble, and stood in its opening, shouting curses in French. Amazed and without a thought of danger, I ran across the street, bursting in on them like a whirlwind. They paid no attention to me. "Hey," I said, shaking one of them by his straps, "are you French?" They turned toward me and looked at me for a fraction of a second. Then their eyes returned to a cloud of dust and smoke pouring from a house which had just burst into flames. "No, the Walloon Division," one of them said, without looking back a second time. A series of explosions made us blink and hunch our shoulders. Those shits shoot us just like rabbits. They never take prisoners, the bastards. "I'm French," I said with an uncertain smile. "Well then, look out, volunteers are never prisoners." "But I'm not a volunteer." The street was raked by a new salvo of mortar fire, somewhat closer than before. 20 yards away, a roof disintegrated, and the retreat whistle broke off our conversation. We ran as hard as we could back the way we had just come, followed by a burst of machine gun fire. 2 or 3 men spun round and doubled up, screaming with pain. We almost ran over 2 men with a heavy machine gun, which they hadn't been able to fire because we'd been in the way. Several groups of men had reached a street at right angles to ours and had scattered among the ruins. The lieutenant was blowing his whistle again to regroup us when 2 Mark III's suddenly came into sight. They rolled up to the lieutenant, who stood in the middle of the street waving them forward. After a brief consultation, they moved obliquely into the street we had just left, advancing toward the Bolsheviks. The lieutenant tried to reorganize us again, and we set off in the wake of the tanks, which made an infernal din in the rubble-filled streets. I jumped from the corners of buildings to piles of rubble in a state of terror, unable to grasp why I was there or to distinguish anything to fire at. For seconds at a time, our tanks would disappear from view in the turmoil of dust and smoke and flames, but they always re-emerged, with their guns firing. Soon we had run past the point where our retreat had begun, and into an open space surrounded by wooden peasant houses grouped around a pond. The tanks were driving around the pond, crushing every obstacle. On the far side of the pond, we could easily see men running in several directions. We stood on the bank and opened a concentrated fire. Another German company arrived on our right and threw grenades at a house in which some of the enemy had taken shelter. Our tanks were now on the other side of the pond and were flattening the position just taken from the enemy. At last, I had the opportunity to fire at some Russians. They were no more than 30 yards away. Running from the house our soldiers had attacked with grenades. At least 10 Mausers fired, and not one of the Russians stood up again. The fact that we were advancing and that we felt ourselves suddenly in control of the situation stimulated us in spite of everything. We had just dislodged an enemy numerically stronger than we, as was always the case in Russia, and we felt as if we'd been given wings. The sound of firing and the groans of the wounded incited us to massacre the Russians who had inflicted us with so many horrifying wounds. An attacking army is always more enthusiastic than an army on the defensive and more likely to accomplish prodigies. This was particularly true of the German army, which was organized to attack and whose defense consisted of slowing the enemy by counterattack. A few of our men took over a Russian cannon and immediately put it into action. A rapid liaison was established between our two tanks and this newly improvised artillery, which poured all the shells just captured from the Russians onto precisely selected targets. Then the tanks turned back, leaving the defense of the area to us. Directed by the lieutenant, we placed ourselves as best we could, in readiness for any new surprises. We could hear the sound of continuous firing all around us. A fine rain began to fall. At dusk, we were still exchanging fire with the enemy, who had grown bolder and were trying to come back. With darkness, our terror returned, and the firing almost stopped. The lieutenant sent someone to fetch some flares. To the southwest, the horizon lit up in time with sporadic heavy artillery fire. Without knowing it, we had become part of the Third Battle of Kharkov, whose front extended for some 200 miles around the city. With darkness and rain, the fighting, for our group, was almost over. Behind us, we could still hear the sound of automatics, which penetrated the noise of engines. Our vehicles were using the darkness to try to get through the Russian barrage. We thought that at any moment we might see the Popovs running toward us through the night. A Volkswagen came up from behind with all its lights out. The driver spoke for a moment with the leader of our group and then handed some flat mines to 4 of our men. With white faces, they went off into the darkness to place the mines on either side of the pond. 5 minutes later, we heard a rough cry from the left, and a short time after that, 2 of the 4 came back from the right. After another half hour, we concluded that the 2 who had gone to the left had run into a Russian knife. Much later that night, when we were all feeling overwhelmed by sleep, we witnessed a tragedy that froze my blood. We had just thrown about a dozen grenades at random to forestall some suspected danger when a prolonged and penetrating cry rose from the hole on my left. It lasted for several minutes, as if it were coming from the throat of someone who was fighting desperately. Then there was a cry for help, which brought us all from our holes and shelters. About 10 of us ran toward the sound. The darkness was torn by the white lights of several shots. Fortunately, no one was hit. We arrived at the edge of a foxhole where a Russian, who had just thrown down his revolver, was holding his hands in the air. At the bottom of the hole, 2 men were fighting. One of them, a Russian, was waving a large cutlass, holding a man from our group pinned beneath him. 2 of us covered the Russian who had raised his hands, while a young Obergefreiter jumped into the hole and struck the other Russian a blow on the back of his neck with a trenching tool. The Russian let go at once, and the German who had been under him, who had just missed having his throat cut, ran up to ground level. He was covered with blood, brandishing the Russian knife with one hand like a madman, while with the other he tried to stop the flow of blood pouring from his wound. "Where is he?" he shouted in a fury. "Where's the other one?" In a few bounding steps, he reached the 2 men and their prisoner. Before anyone could do anything, he had run his knife into the belly of the petrified Russian. "Cutthroat!" he yelled, looking with wild eyes for another belly to open. We had to hold him so he wouldn't run past our lines. "Let me go!" he shrieked. "I want to show these savages how to use a knife." "Shut up!" shouted the lieutenant, exasperated by having to deal with such a motley crew. "Get back into your foxholes before Ivan machine guns the lot of you." The lunatic, who was losing a lot of blood, was dragged to the rear by 2 men. I went back to the hole I was sharing with 4 others. I would gladly have fallen asleep, but nervous exhaustion kept me awake. I had not yet absorbed all the emotions of the day and was suffering a belated reaction. The intermittent rain began to soak into our clothes and weight them down. The pond gave off a faint smell. 2 men began to snore. Throughout the night, which seemed interminable, I kept up a dull conversation with my companions to prevent a nervous collapse. In the distance, we could hear the continuous rumble of our retreating trucks. Enemy action began again well before dawn. Flares above our position blinded us with their unexpected white lights. We looked at each other in wordless confusion. The intensity of this diabolic light threw a sinister, almost indecent glare on our ghostly faces. At daybreak, enemy artillery poured a hail of projectiles of every caliber onto the road about a quarter of a mile behind us. Beyond my hole, when I dared look outside, I could see other helmets poking up here and there from below the ground. Under their visors, eyes gleaming with fatigue were trying to discern our immediate future on the dim bank across the pond. I scraped up some crumbs of vitamin biscuit, which was the last food in my possession. Insomnia and exhaustion made us incapable of grasping the situation with any precision. We were simply there, shivering and wet, and if even a small group of Russians had appeared, we wouldn't have been able to stop them. Fortunately, the Soviets didn't attack, and we were only subjected to one round of mortar fire, which nevertheless wounded 9 of us. At last, the sun rose, and we felt somewhat better. When it reached its zenith, we were still waiting in our holes, which the spring warmth had not been able to dry out. We had not been given any more food, but then a soldier of the Reich was supposed to be able to withstand cold, heat, rain, suffering, hunger, and fear. Our stomachs growled, and the blood beat in our temples and at our smallest joints, but the air and the earth and the universe were growling too. From habit, we were almost able to persuade ourselves that this was a possible way to live. I know of many who actually managed it. Toward 6 o'clock that evening, we were ordered to abandon our positions. This step required many precautions. We had to cover a considerable distance with all our equipment, while 2 men stayed behind to lay mines for the enemy. When we reached the ruins of the first house, we were finally able to straighten up. We went into the battered buildings whenever we could to look for food. I can remember devouring 3 raw potatoes and finding them delicious. We arrived at the crossroads from which our group had set out 24 hours earlier. The 2 mutilated but recognizable roads we had taken the day before had been turned into a jumble of churned earth. As far as I could see, the disabled carcasses of Wehrmacht vehicles lay scattered in a haze of whirling smoke across the ruins of what must once have been houses. There were several muddy German bodies, too, lying in rigid attitudes beside wrecked machines waiting for the burial squad. That concludes the 10th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.